In the early hours of June 6, 1944, as thousands of Allied paratroopers descended through the darkness over Normandy and landing craft approached the French coast, the most powerful military deception in history was reaching its climax. For months, the Allies had orchestrated an elaborate illusion designed to convince Adolf Hitler and his generals that the invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, not Normandy. What followed was not a sudden revelation, but a slow, agonizing awakening that would cost Germany the war. This is the story of what Hitler's generals said and did when they finally realized that D-Day was not a diversion, but the main event. And before we dive into this incredible story, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss more fascinating stories from World War II. Your comments and engagement help us bring you more content like this. The seeds of German confusion were planted long before the first Allied soldiers set foot on French soil. Beginning in 1943, Allied planners understood that the success of any invasion would depend not just on military might, but on the enemy's perception of where and when that might would be deployed. They created Operation Bodyguard, an umbrella of deception operations designed to mislead German intelligence about Allied intentions across all of Europe. Within Bodyguard was Operation Fortitude, which itself split into two distinct campaigns. Fortitude North suggested an invasion of Norway would be launched from Scotland. Fortitude South, the more elaborate and ultimately more successful deception, pointed toward Pas-de-Calais as the primary invasion site. The architects of Fortitude South understood German military thinking with remarkable precision. Pas-de-Calais made logical sense as an invasion target. It was the shortest route across the English Channel, only 20 miles of water separating England from France. It offered the most direct path to Germany itself. The port facilities were superior to those in Normandy. German defensive doctrine, shaped by decades of military theory, insisted that invaders would choose the path of least resistance and greatest strategic value. The Allies turned this logical thinking into a weapon against Germany. To make the deception convincing, the Allies created an entirely fictional army. The first United States Army group, known as FUSAG, existed only in radio transmissions, falsified documents, and the reports of double agents. Yet to German intelligence, it appeared to be a massive force of 50 divisions assembling in southeastern England, directly across from Pas-de-Calais. The Allies positioned General George Patton as FUSAG's commander, a masterstroke of psychological warfare. Patton was known to German intelligence as America's most aggressive and capable field commander. His presence at the head of FUSAG lent the Phantom Army an air of authenticity that no amount of fake radio traffic alone could have achieved. The physical aspects of the deception were equally elaborate. Dummy tanks, constructed from inflatable rubber and wood frames, dotted the landscape of southeastern England. From the air, German reconnaissance flights saw exactly what the Allies wanted them to see: vast tank parks, supply depots, and military encampments. Landing craft that would never touch water bobbed in harbors. The Allies even generated false radio traffic, broadcasting everything from ammunition orders to mess hall complaints, creating an intricate audible ghost that German signals intelligence found utterly convincing. But the true brilliance of Fortitude South lay in its human elements, the double agents who fed German intelligence a steady diet of lies wrapped in just enough truth to be believable. The most successful of these was a Spaniard named Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo by the British. Garbo had approached British intelligence offering his services, and when they initially rejected him, he began fabricating intelligence reports for the Germans entirely on his own initiative. His invented information was so convincing that British intelligence eventually recruited him. By 1944, Garbo supposedly ran a network of 27 subagents throughout Britain, every single one of them fictional, yet the Germans trusted his intelligence implicitly. The deception worked because it told the Germans what they already believed. Hitler himself had long insisted that Pas-de-Calais would be the invasion site. His military intuition, which had served him well in the early years of the war but increasingly led him astray as the conflict progressed, told him that the Allies would strike at the closest, most logical point. This conviction became an article of faith among many in the German High Command, not because the evidence overwhelmingly supported it, but because contradicting the Führer's judgment carried severe professional and sometimes physical consequences. The German defensive situation in France was complicated by a fundamental disagreement between two of Hitler's most senior commanders. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, the legendary Desert Fox who had been given responsibility for defending the Atlantic Wall, believed the invasion must be defeated on the beaches. His experience in North Africa fighting against Allied air superiority had taught him that moving large formations during daylight was suicidal under modern air power. Rommel argued for positioning panzer divisions close to the coast where they could immediately counterattack any landing force before it could establish a secure beachhead. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, Rommel's superior and Commander-in-Chief West, held an opposing view. Von Rundstedt was a traditional Prussian officer of the old school, and he believed in defense in depth. He wanted to hold the panzer reserves inland, away from the coast, where they could be massed for a powerful counterattack once the Allies had committed themselves and revealed the location of their main effort. Both men were experienced, capable commanders. Both strategies had merit. The tragedy for Germany was that Hitler's interference prevented either strategy from being properly implemented. Hitler personally reserved the authority to move any panzer division. This was partly due to his increasing megalomania and distrust of his generals, and partly because of Germany's desperate fuel situation. Every movement of armored forces consumed precious petroleum that Germany could barely afford to spend. As a result, when the invasion came, the panzer division sat immobile, waiting for permission that would come too late. In the pre-dawn darkness of June 6, 1944, the first reports began reaching German headquarters. Allied paratroopers were dropping over the Cotentin Peninsula. Naval forces were approaching the Normandy coast. The initial German response was characterized by confusion and a dangerous certainty that this could not be the main invasion. General Max Pemsel, commanding the German 7th Army in Normandy, reported the landings but characterized them as a secondary operation. The consensus in those early hours, from the coastal bunkers to the highest echelons of command, was clear and tragically mistaken. This was precisely the kind of diversionary attack they had been expecting. The confusion was compounded by an almost farcical command failure. Adolf Hitler, operating on his increasingly nocturnal schedule, was asleep at his headquarters when the invasion began. General Alfred Jodl, Chief of Operations Staff, made the fateful decision not to wake the Führer. For several crucial hours, as Allied forces fought to establish their beachheads and German defenders struggled to coordinate an effective response, the only man with authority to release the panzer reserves slept peacefully, unaware that the most important battle of the war had begun. When Hitler finally awoke and learned of the landings, he still believed this was a diversion. The real invasion, the massive assault led by Patton against Pas-de-Calais, was surely still to come. Admiral Karl Dönitz, commander of the German Navy, recorded in his diary that he received news of the landing around 2 in the morning. Between 5 and 6 o'clock, he was contacted by Admiral Theodor Kranke, who informed him that Supreme Headquarters was hesitating to send all available divisions to the invasion area. Dönitz requested to speak directly with General Jodl. He told Jodl that he believed this was the real invasion and that German countermeasures should be set in motion with great urgency. Jodl replied that the Commander-in-Chief West still had doubts. Dönitz's opinion was hard to discount. He was one of Germany's most capable military leaders, yet his warning went unheeded because it contradicted the established belief that Calais was the true objective. As the morning progressed and Allied forces pushed inland from the beaches, the cognitive dissonance in German headquarters grew more acute. The scale of the Normandy landings was clearly enormous. Thousands of ships filled the channel. The air was thick with Allied aircraft. Yet German intelligence continued to report that Patton's massive fusiliers remained in southeastern England, ready to launch the real invasion. Every piece of information the Germans received seemed to confirm that Normandy was a diversion designed to draw German reserves away from Calais before the main blow fell. 3 days after the invasion, on June 9th, the double agent Garbo sent what may have been his masterpiece of deception. He transmitted to his German handlers a detailed message about Fusag's order of battle, expressing profound regret that his prior warnings about the Normandy diversion had not been acted upon more decisively. This message arrived after the invasion had already succeeded in establishing a beachhead, which paradoxically made it more credible. Garbo wasn't claiming to have advanced knowledge. He was explaining why the Germans should have realized Normandy was a feint. The message cemented his credibility at the precise moment when German command most needed reliable intelligence. The Germans believed every word. The early fighting in Normandy was brutal and confused. Allied forces, particularly the Americans landing on Omaha Beach, suffered heavy casualties. The hedgerow country of the Bocage proved to be a defender's paradise, every field a potential fortress. German troops, despite being surprised and initially overwhelmed, fought with their characteristic skill and determination. For the soldiers engaged in the fighting, the battle was clearly real enough. But in the command posts and headquarters, farther removed from the front, the illusion held firm. This was a diversion. The main invasion would come at Calais. On June 17th, 11 days after the invasion, Field Marshals Rommel and von Rundstedt met with Hitler at Margival near Soissons. Both commanders came hoping to convince the Führer of the gravity of the situation. Rommel asked for permission to pull his troops back from the Normandy coast so they could regroup for an inland counteroffensive out of range of the devastating Allied naval gunfire. Allied warships sitting offshore could bring down such massive firepower that any German movement in open country during daylight was effectively impossible. Von Rundstedt supported Rommel's assessment of the tactical situation. Hitler refused. He would not authorize a withdrawal. Instead, he attempted to soothe his field marshals with promises of wonder weapons that would soon turn the tide. Newly developed jet-powered aircraft would sweep the Allies from the sky. Self-propelled flying bombs, the V-1 rockets that were just beginning to fall on London, would bring Britain to its knees and force the Allies to withdraw. These superweapons would solve the problem in the West, Hitler assured them. There was no need for operational withdrawals or strategic reordering of forces. The Normandy bridgehead would be crushed, and when Patton's real invasion came at Calais, German forces would be in position to defeat that as well. The meeting was inconclusive, except for Hitler's authorization of small adjustments in the front line. Both field marshals left frustrated and deeply concerned. The realization that Normandy was not a diversion did not come as a sudden dramatic declaration in a smoke-filled room. It was a creeping, sickening certainty that spread through the German high command like a contagion. It began with the soldiers and junior officers at the front, the men who could see with their own eyes the scale of Allied commitment, the endless stream of reinforcements pouring across the beaches, the massive buildup of supplies and equipment. These men sent reports up the chain of command describing what they saw, but their superiors, committed to the Calais theory, interpreted every piece of evidence through that lens. General Erich Marx, one of Germany's most capable corps commanders, was among the first senior officers to voice doubts about the Calais assumption. Shortly before he was struck down in action by an Allied fighter-bomber, Marx told his subordinates that if they could not throw the invaders back into the sea within days, the battle for France would be lost. His warning was prophetic. But even Marx's death and the growing casualties in Normandy were not enough to shake the fundamental belief at the highest levels of command that this was all part of an Allied deception, that Normandy was designed to bleed German forces before the real attack came. The deception held with a tenacity that is almost unbelievable in retrospect. For 7 crucial weeks after D-Day, Hitler and the German High Command continued to believe that Normandy was a secondary attack. The powerful 15th Army, with approximately 200,000 men and substantial armored formations, remained in the Pas-de-Calais region, waiting for an invasion that would never come. These were not second-rate occupation troops, but some of Germany's best remaining divisions, fully equipped and positioned to defend against a threat that existed only in falsified intelligence reports and radio transmissions from non-existent units. This was the ultimate triumph of Operation Fortitude. While German and Allied forces ground against each other in the bloody Bocage fighting, while British and Canadian troops struggled to take Caen, while American forces fought through the hedgerows field by field, 200,000 German soldiers sat idle in Pas-de-Calais. If even half of those forces had been committed to Normandy in the first week after the invasion, the battle might have taken a very different course. The Allied beachhead, particularly in its first precarious days, could potentially have been crushed by a massive armored counter-offensive. But that counter-offensive never came, because the tanks and men that might have launched it were defending against a phantom army. On June 29th, Rommel and von Rundstedt met with Hitler again, this time at his mountain retreat at Berchtesgaden. It was now 23 days after the invasion, and the situation in Normandy continued to deteriorate from the German perspective. Allied forces were firmly entrenched. The buildup of men and material continued unabated. The field marshals came with increasingly desperate assessments. Von Rundstedt had filed a report stressing the impossibility of moving tanks by day in open country under Allied air superiority. He warned about Allied control of the skies and the need for reliable communications, recommending cyclists, motorcycle messengers, and even runners, because wire communications in the battle area were futile, constantly cut by artillery fire and air attacks. Hitler remained unmoved. He praised the heroism of German troops, but refused to acknowledge the strategic reality. New weapons would turn the tide. V-1 flying bombs continued to hit London. Soon there would be V-2 rockets, even more devastating. Jet aircraft were entering production. These technological marvels would restore German air superiority and allow for effective ground operations. The Führer's faith in technology and his own intuition remained unshakable, even as the evidence mounted that his generals were telling him the truth. The Normandy invasion was not a diversion. It was the main event, and Germany was losing. The gradual awakening to reality was painful and incomplete. Different commanders reached the conclusion at different times, and even then, the fog of war and the lingering effects of the deception made it difficult to be certain. Some historians suggest that full acceptance that Normandy was the sole major invasion only came in late July or early August, a full 2 months after D-Day. By that time, the Allies had broken out of the Normandy bridgehead, and the strategic situation had fundamentally changed. The breakout, when it came, was devastating. Operation Cobra, launched on July 25th by American forces, shattered the German defensive line in the west. General Omar Bradley's 1st U.S. Army punched through near St. Lo, and General George Patton finally committed to battle with his real Third Army rather than his phantom Fusag, exploded through the gap. Patton's forces raced into Brittany and then turned east, threatening to envelop the entire German position in Normandy. The war of position in the hedgerows suddenly became a war of movement, and the Germans were on the wrong side of it. Hitler's response to this crisis demonstrated how completely he had lost touch with military reality. Rather than authorize a fighting withdrawal to the Seine River, where German forces might have established a new defensive line, Hitler ordered a counterattack. Operation Lüttich was designed to drive westward from Mortain to Avranches on the coast, cutting off Patton's spearhead and restoring the front. It was a plan born of desperation and delusion. The Germans hastily assembled panzer divisions and launched their attack on August 7th. Ultra-intelligence, the Allied code-breaking operation that decrypted German radio traffic, had given advance warning of the attack. American forces were ready. When the German panzers advanced, they ran into a prepared defense. Heavy anti-tank guns and artillery stopped the offensive in its tracks. Worse, the concentration of German armor for the attack had created a vulnerable salient. Allied commanders saw an opportunity for encirclement. American forces would drive north from the south, while British and Canadian forces attacked south from Caen. The objective was Falaise, and the goal was to trap the entire German force in Normandy in a pocket and destroy it. The Falaise pocket became a killing ground. German forces, belatedly recognizing their peril, attempted to retreat through the narrowing gap between the converging Allied armies. The newly arrived Polish 1st Armored Division held a critical position in the path of the German withdrawal. Despite heroic German efforts to break through, and equally heroic Polish efforts to hold them back, the escape route remained partially open just long enough for some German forces to slip through. Between August 16th and 19th, remnants of the German 7th Army and 5th Panzer Army, the latter now commanded by Joseph Seb Dietrich, one of Hitler's most trusted SS commanders, broke through the encirclement. Approximately 240,000 German soldiers eventually reached the Seine River, but they left behind in Normandy 50,000 dead and 200,000 prisoners. Virtually all of their heavy equipment, the tanks and artillery and vehicles that made a modern army mobile and effective, was lost. The field marshal who might have managed the disaster more effectively was no longer in command. Gerd von Rundstedt had been relieved on July 1st after a heated telephone conversation with Field Marshal Wilhelm Keitel, Chief of the Armed Forces High Command. When asked what should be done about the situation in France, von Rundstedt reportedly replied with bitter frankness that they should make peace, and he added a profane suggestion about where the peace negotiations might take place. Hitler replaced him with Field Marshal Günther von Kluge, but von Kluge fared no better. Caught between Hitler's impossible orders and battlefield reality, suspected of disloyalty after the failed plot to assassinate Hitler on July 20th, von Kluge ended his own life on August 19th rather than return to Germany to face Hitler's judgment. Erwin Rommel never saw the final disaster in Normandy. On July 17th, his staff car was strafed by an Allied fighter. Rommel was severely wounded with head injuries and played no further part in the campaign. He was recovering in Germany when the conspiracy to eliminate Hitler was uncovered. Rommel's name was connected to the plot, though the extent of his actual involvement remains debated by historians. Hitler gave Rommel a choice: face trial and disgrace, with consequences for his family, or take poison and receive a state funeral as a fallen hero. On October 14, 1944, Rommel chose the poison. The Desert Fox, who had spent the months before D-Day trying to convince Hitler of the realities of Allied military power and German vulnerability, became another casualty of the Führer's refusal to accept truth. The question of when exactly German commanders definitively realized that Normandy was not a diversion is difficult to answer with precision, because the realization came at different times for different individuals, and because after the war there was a natural tendency for surviving German officers to claim they had understood the truth earlier than they actually did. Documentary evidence suggests that the belief in a subsequent Calais invasion persisted in some quarters well into late July, approximately 7 weeks after D-Day. Even when individual commanders became personally convinced that Normandy was the sole invasion, the institutional momentum of the deception continued to influence German dispositions and decisions. The success of Operation Fortitude must be measured not just in the initial surprise achieved on D-Day, But in these weeks of continued confusion that followed, Allied planners had hoped the deception would delay German reinforcements for at least 14 days. The actual delay was far longer. The 15th Army remained largely immobile in Pas-de-Calais for weeks after it became obvious to frontline commanders that every available German soldier was needed in Normandy. The paralysis at the top of the German command structure, the combination of Hitler's ideological certainty and the lingering effects of the masterful Allied deception, kept hundreds of thousands of German troops out of the decisive battle. There were individual German officers who questioned the Calais assumption earlier than others. Some junior commanders and intelligence officers raised doubts within days of the invasion. But in the hierarchical, authoritarian structure of the German military, especially as it existed under Hitler's increasingly paranoid and irrational leadership, such doubts were dangerous to voice. Officers who contradicted Hitler's preconceptions risked their careers and sometimes their lives. The failed assassination attempt on July 20th demonstrated that dissent, even military dissent based on professional judgment, could be treated as treasonous conspiracy. In such an environment, admitting that one had been fooled by Allied deception was not merely embarrassing, it was potentially fatal. After the war, when Allied intelligence officers interrogated captured German generals and analyzed captured documents, the full extent of the deception became clear. German intelligence files showed that they had created detailed orders of battle for Fusag and other fictional Allied formations. They had tracked the movements of divisions that never existed. They had noted the arrival of American units that were entirely imaginary. The phantom army created by inflatable tanks, false radio transmissions, and double agents had taken on a reality in German planning documents that was indistinguishable from actual Allied forces. The human cost of the German command failure in Normandy was immense. German soldiers fought with skill and determination throughout the campaign, often achieving local tactical successes despite overwhelming Allied material superiority. But they were betrayed by a command structure that could not adapt to changing circumstances and a leader who refused to acknowledge reality. The soldiers who held the Normandy beachhead against desperate Allied attacks in June did so without adequate reinforcements because those reinforcements were waiting for a phantom invasion. The panzer divisions that might have driven the Allies back into the sea sat immobile because Hitler would not release them. And when he finally did, it was too late. The troops who were encircled at Falaise fought with desperate courage to escape, but they should never have been in that position in the first place. By late August 1944, the Allied deception operations were officially ended. There was no longer any need to maintain the fiction of Fusage threatening Pas-de-Calais because Allied forces had broken out of Normandy and were racing across France. Paris was liberated on August 25th. Allied armies were approaching the German border. The strategic situation had been transformed. On September 28, 1944, it was formally agreed to end the Fortitude deception and transfer any remaining operational deceptions to overall Allied command. The phantom army that had helped win the war was finally allowed to dissolve into the air from which it had been conjured. The legacy of what happened when Hitler's generals realized D-Day was not a diversion extends far beyond the immediate military consequences. It represents one of the most successful strategic deception operations in military history. The Allies had not merely surprised their enemy, they had fundamentally shaped how that enemy understood the battle even after it had begun. They created a false reality so convincing that German commanders continued to act on it even as evidence to the contrary mounted. The deception worked because it exploited existing German assumptions and told them what they were already predisposed to believe. For the German generals who eventually understood the truth, the realization must have been devastating. They had been outfought and outthought. Their intelligence services had been thoroughly penetrated and manipulated. Their leader had proven incapable of accepting military reality, even when his most experienced commanders pleaded with him to see reason. The German army in France, which had held every advantage of terrain and prepared defenses, which was staffed by experienced soldiers and led by capable field commanders, had been defeated not just by Allied military might, but by Allied cunning and by their own command structure's fatal flaws. The statements and reactions of German generals when they realized Normandy was not a diversion were often not recorded in formal documents. Many of these moments happened in private conversations, in staff meetings, in the chaos of military operations under extreme pressure. What we know comes from post-war accounts, interrogations, diaries, and captured documents. Some generals claimed after the war that they had never believed in the Calais deception, but contemporary evidence suggests otherwise. The truth is that most German senior commanders were fooled, to varying degrees and for varying lengths of time, by one of the most elaborate and successful military deceptions ever conducted. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, in his post-war interrogations, acknowledged the devastating effectiveness of Allied air power and naval gunfire, but he was more circumspect about the intelligence failures that had left German forces so poorly positioned to respond to the actual invasion. Admiral Donitz's diary entry reveals his early suspicions that Normandy was the real invasion, but also documents how his warnings were ignored by those who believed otherwise. General Marx's reported statements before his passing suggested a dawning awareness of the disaster, but not a full understanding of how thoroughly German intelligence had been compromised. The most telling evidence may be in what German commanders did rather than what they said. The continued retention of the 15th Army at Pas-de-Calais for weeks after D-Day, the delay in committing panzer reserves, the piecemeal nature of German reinforcements to Normandy. All of these operational decisions reflect a command structure that remained uncertain about Allied intentions well after those intentions should have been obvious. When commanders are certain of enemy intentions, they commit their reserves decisively. The German failure to do so in the critical weeks after D-Day reveals persistent doubt and confusion at the highest levels of command. If you've found this story fascinating and want to explore more incredible tales from World War II, make sure you're subscribed to our channel and leave a comment telling us what aspect of the war you'd like us to cover next. Your engagement helps us continue producing these in-depth historical documentaries. The story of what Hitler's generals said when they realized D-Day was not a diversion is ultimately a story about the fog of war, about how commanders must make decisions based on incomplete and often contradictory information, and about what happens when a military organization's command structure becomes so dysfunctional that truth cannot penetrate to those who most need to hear it. The Allied deception operations created the fog. German intelligence failures thickened it. Hitler's authoritarian leadership style made it impossible to dispel. And German soldiers paid the price for the resulting confusion with their lives and their ultimate defeat in France. The Normandy campaign did not end the war in Europe, but it made Germany's eventual defeat inevitable. After Normandy, Germany fought on for another 9 months, but it was fighting without hope of victory, only to delay defeat. The failure of German commanders to recognize and respond appropriately to the Normandy invasion in its crucial early stages was one of the key turning points of World War II. It was a failure of intelligence, of command, of leadership, and ultimately of a military system that had subordinated professional military judgment to political ideology and the whims of a leader who had lost touch with reality. The men who fought in Normandy on both sides displayed courage and skill that transcended the strategic confusion of their commanders. The German soldiers who held the beaches against overwhelming odds, who fought in the bocage with determination and tactical expertise, who struggled to escape the Falaise encirclement, were not failures. They were let down by a command structure that could not adapt to the reality of Allied invasion, and by a deception operation so successful that it paralyzed German strategic decision-making for weeks after the invasion began. For the Allies, Operation Fortitude stands as a triumph of planning, coordination, and execution. The creation of FUSAG, the management of double agents, the physical deception measures, the signals intelligence, all of it came together to create an illusion that fundamentally shaped how Germany fought the Battle of Normandy. The operation saved countless Allied lives by preventing Germany from concentrating its full defensive power against the actual invasion. It bought time for Allied forces to establish and expand their beachhead, and it demonstrated that in modern warfare, deception and information warfare could be as decisive as guns and tanks. When historians look back at June and July of 1944, they see a campaign decided as much by what German generals believed as by what Allied soldiers did. The courage of the men who stormed the beaches was essential. The skill of Allied planners and commanders was crucial, but the success of Operation Fortitude and the German command failure to recognize the truth about Normandy in time to respond effectively may have been the decisive factor that turned a risky amphibious assault into a strategic victory that changed the course of the war and history itself.